It's an honor to be able to talk to you guys today. I will kind of quickly give you guys a little bit of my background, and then we'll walk through the slides. So my name is Josh Broadbent, if my clicker works, because I've been playing with it this whole time. Yeah, there we go. My name is Josh Broadbent. I am the RVP of Solutions Engineering for BT Public Sector. Hey, Austin, I would leave that one open because I think they lock when you shut them. So that's why I was going to leave that one. I am the RVP of Solutions Engineering for BeyondTrust Public Sector. I have been in IT for 25 years. I realize that makes me look I'm a lot younger than that should make me, but I did start an MSP when I was 12, which apparently is young for that kind of thing. I had multiple industry certifications by the time I was 14, which apparently is also young. After starting the MSP, I did that for almost 15 years, and I have been in the federal space for about 10. I have architected over 3 million user accounts for identity and access management solutions inside the federal and DoD space. So I've been here for a minute. So that tells you my professional career, but I always like people to know who I am, right? So I am married. I have 4 kids. I have 2 kids that I kind of adopted along with my best friend, John, that you can see next to me. Usually when I tell people I have 4 kids, I say that I have 1 and 3 spares. So if any of you want extra kids, I have them. You're more than welcome to have some. I do a lot of random things. My kids now do a lot of random things. I love dad jokes. You'll figure that out here shortly, I promise. I am a nerd in about every sense of the word. Every type of nerd you could think of just about is a thing that I do, including, we just got back from Universal, and that's one of my favorite pictures that I've ever taken of myself. I have a 6-year-old lab named Darth Vader, because it wasn't obvious enough that I was a nerd. In my free time, I actually do social work inside prisons, playing softball. And so the little picture of the softball, and I know it's really hard to see, is actually a softball that hit the razor wire inside a prison fence. And it ripped the softball wide open, and it was pretty cool. In the summertime, when my kids aren't playing sports, which there are several things up there, we wakeboard and surfboard, or wake surf. And we do a whole lot of gaming. So you can't see the 5th TV in that one, but there's actually 5 TVs in my living room. And we all game, my whole family, from my wife on down to my 4-year-old who's learning how to play Fortnite on her own, which is pretty funny. Anyways, so that's me. Who are we as a company? We, as a company, have over 1,250 employees in 18 countries. We are headquartered right here in the United States, complete with FOCI paperwork, all of that good stuff. We have 75 patents inside the PAM space, which is pretty cool, considering that PAM has only been around for the better part, for most people, for the better part of like 10, 15 years. We actually have patents in the space dating back to the mid-90s when we did some work around sudo access and Linux. So we do have 75 R&D patents in the space, so we've been here for a long time. It was not an afterthought for us. So, my current event slide, and the fun thing about putting together a current event slide when it comes to data breaches is it's expired almost before we do it, right? So there are several newspaper clippings on here, and some of you are going to go, oh, that was last year. Oh, that was 6 months ago. Well, you're right, but if I did this like updated for the ones that fit on the page, I'd be doing this every day, and I'm too lazy to do that. I'm just going to be honest. So, but what we do see is a perpetuation of this, right? It's a continuation. It happens all the time. And ultimately, it's why our government released Zero Trust guidance, because they understood that we were woefully underprepared for our critical infrastructure, our cyber infrastructure, to be able to handle the things that we needed to handle. So it's why we ended up with NIST 800-207 and the Zero Trust architecture guidance. It's why we ended up with an SM8 that actually gave some instructions around following that particular thing, putting together a plan, all of those good things. So clearly everybody in this room already knows why Zero Trust is supposed to be implemented. I'm going to take a brief second and just say, we worked through this for 30 years trying to build a really big castle for our networks. I'm sorry, I keep looking down. We're trying to build a really big castle for our networks. And we thought, hey, if we build this castle big enough, if we build the walls tall enough, and maybe if we put some moats around it, I don't know, throw some alligators or something in it, I don't know, that as long as we kept everybody out, everything on the inside would be okay. And as long as everything on the inside was okay, we could just trust those people. Which is really funny because, like, that's never been a thing in the existence of the world, back down to the Trojan horse. Like, we just let crap in our we let crap in our castles, and here we go. This is a really pretty gift. It's a thing that we do, right? So, but then we had work from home. And what we ended up with, and actually it's funny, they were talking about this earlier in a session that I was in, there is a significant increase in state actors and threat actors attacking residents, and specifically government employee residents' networks, because they find a weak point in the routers and network equipment in a home, right? People don't change their passwords. It happens all the time. I come from a small town in Arkansas, so I'm not even really going to tell you what the name of it is. But it's really funny to me because people will talk to me as a cybersecurity expert, and they'll have these conversations about, well, I'm afraid to have a baby camera hooked up in my house because somebody's going to see it. And I'm like, well, maybe, but in the instructions where it tells you to change the password, if you change the password, the chances are people are just going to ignore it, right? If you put a default app baby cam on your baby, yes, people are going to stare at your baby, and I might do it just to play a joke on you at this point. Like, I don't know what you want. But we still do that. Like, we do that all the time. At DEF CON this past year, somebody actually got to present, a college freshman got to present at DEF CON because his school didn't change the default passwords on their AV equipment, and he rickrolled the entire school. While I find it fascinating that somebody that young got to present at DEF CON, as somebody who's been in cybersecurity for 25 plus years, knowing the default password to something is no longer hacking. Like, this takes no skill whatsoever. This is something I would expect my junior high student to do when he can read a manual. Like, this is not something that's important. But the truth is, as a group of people, we weren't prepared for work from home. We weren't prepared to have our kids' Xboxes on corporate networks. So it's why perimeter security doesn't work, because we can't build a perimeter big enough to handle our kids' Wii's in the living room along with the admin assistants or technologists that are working at home. We just can't. So we have to do something different. So we combine that information with the fact that overall, we see that increase in breach that we talked about a minute ago, and we have to get to a place where we just assume breach, right? We assume that somebody is always in our network, and therefore the traffic that flows inside our network needs to be monitored and maintained. We need to constantly re-authenticate. We need to constantly reauthorize. We need to verify access. All of those things. When we're doing that, what we're doing is we're maintaining this posture of like least privilege or just-in-time privilege across our entire network. And it happens more than just with privilege access. It happens with the way that we micro-segment things. It happens with the way that we handle our data. It happens across all 5 pillars of zero trust, basically simultaneously, that we are assuming breach and constantly verifying the information that needs to be there. So we have to accept this new reality of a network, of what network security should be. And by the way, as we continue to have this conversation, I've heard it a million times today, and I will continue to repeat it. There is not a zero trust product on the market. If somebody sells you a product that solves your zero trust problems, I have some beachfront property that I would really like to sell you, and we can talk about pricing later. It's really not that big of a deal. But it's funny because all the way back to the executive order that came out in 2021 when they started talking about zero trust, I remember being at my first in-person show right after that. TechNet Cyber Baltimore. And like catty corner from me, 100 feet away, there was an infrastructure wiring vendor that had zero trust all over their booth. Like, they sold cabling. Literally, they sold cables. But they figured out that if they put zero trust on it, that was the marketing buzzword of the year. So maybe they would get some more attention. And I have attended presentations where I have seen the snake oil being sold, and hey, we can do all of the zero trust across your network. There are 5 pillars to zero trust. We are talking about identity and data and a whole lot of other things, and that's just a thing that's not going to happen that way. So as we talk about these security models, we have to understand that we're not talking about one product. We are talking about what it looks like to continuously verify information across a network so that we know that the person who's there is still supposed to be there. John from GDIT in a presentation yesterday gave the example of, we do this in life, right? We do this kind of building of trust and this authenticity in real life. As we get to know someone, as we understand what they're doing, as we understand what their routine is, we tend to trust them more. It happens in my marriage, right? I don't know how many people in here are married, but my wife and I have been married almost 14 years. And we have a pretty good cadence for what we do. And occasionally, I will do something out of character. Like, it will just be something that I don't normally do. And it really confuses her. And not only does it confuse her, usually what follows is a series of about 50 questions about why I did the particular thing that I did and why it's strange, and she doesn't understand what I'm doing and what's different and what's changed. And like, there's this whole long, I'm not going to call it an interrogation, but that's kind of what it is. I just don't get waterboarded or anything like that. But like, there's this whole thing that happens because all of a sudden, my user behavior has changed to something different than what I was used to, than what she was used to. Now, she has a different response. We have to do the same thing in network security. We have to be able to understand what users are doing, what their typical pattern of behavior is, as we're verifying, as we're authenticating, as we're providing authorization, and then if they change their pattern of behavior or their lack of pattern of behavior, we have to be able to take that and go, hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this, and we need to flag an attribute because they need to either re-authenticate with another method, they need to verify that it's them, add to the list. So there are 3 very simple principles to zero trust across all 5 pillars. Number 1, requires secure and authenticated access to all assets. It's pretty simple. Have a lock and use it. I was reading a pen testing book, a physical security book, by a famous author, and it's his story, so I'm not going to take credit for it, but I don't remember what the author's name is because I read too much. And he was talking about, he did pen testing and security systems for really, really rich customers. And he had this customer that had a huge house, had really nice cars, and he would keep all of his keys in a basket right by the front door, like on this table. And he called him one day and he said, hey, I need you to come. One of my cars got stolen. I want a whole new security system in my entire house. And the guy said, okay. So he comes in, he starts talking to him, doing the consulting thing. He goes, so how did they get the car? And he goes, well, they took the keys and they drove off. Well, how did they get the keys? Well, they walked in the front door. They walked in the front door. Was it locked? No. Your front door wasn't locked? Like, let's not spend $100,000 on a security system when you can't even remember to lock your front door because you're probably not going to set the alarm, right? So at the end of the day, as we talk about authentication, we have to remember that assets that we have, data that we have, anything that we have needs to require authentication to get to it. Anonymous access, unaudited access to data and assets are not a thing that should be occurring in a network anymore. Second, least privilege and enforce access control. It's pretty simple. Are you supposed to be here, and are you supposed to have access to the data that you have access to? And if you don't, you're not allowed to be here. And then we combine all that information, and we do UBA on it, right? So we understand what they're doing, we understand what those patterns are, and we form data and responses based on that. So this is what I call the 5 A's of zero trust. I'm going to patent that someday. Not really, because nobody cares. So we have authentication, stage during the first two are we going to provide authorization and authentication? And how are we going to manage that? Trust that I usually end up in a conversation about. It goes like this. We have been discussing identity, ICAM, IAM, IDAM, whatever you want to give the acronym today, because it's going to be different tomorrow. We've been discussing it for years now. And the truth is, every company is at some stage of acquiring some set of tools that come in somewhere across every one of the 5 pillars. And if you're not coordinating the data in an organized way, if you're not integrating these solutions so that you have actionable intelligence and data, it's not going to really matter that you implemented them. And you're still not going to be any closer to zero trust than you were when you started. What you're going to be is overwhelmed with noise because you have 5 different tools that are all giving you 5 different sets of information. And good luck correlating that data until after you're breached and you have to spend days doing it. So as we talk about zero trust architecture, as we have the conversation about this direction and strategy that we're heading as agencies, as corporations, we end up in this place where we have to understand what our users are doing, when it is exactly that they begin to use improper credentials or act out of character. Like I said, when I do something wrong, my wife recognizes it, and all of a sudden I'm in trouble, right? That's the way that that goes. And it doesn't matter. I can think I'm being as slick as I want to be. I can't tell you how many Christmas surprises have been ruined because I thought I had this covered, and I didn't. So, as we go along with this, we have to be able to correlate this data across multiple different pillars inside that zero trust architecture. And then, of course, we need to be able to audit all of that data. So it's not just about understanding and doing analysis on the data, but it's also about making sure that we have all of that audited for the future so that we can have a record of exactly what happened. This is my favorite slide to hate. I'm just going to say that out loud. I know it's a little bit of an eyesore. You're all going to get the deck after this. So the top of this one is a house that talks about identity and access management, and this actually came out of our CISO's book, so they won't let me change the graphic. That's why it still looks this way, because I've tried. And the one thing that I want to point out, just as a side note, is that this one is still identity and access management. So, you know, we haven't changed the acronym on it yet because it keeps getting updated. But what I like about this is before zero trust was a thing, right? It was identity. If you went to one of these conferences, and a couple of times I had done it, where I was at a conference as a speaker and I didn't have like the industry or vendor badge, and people would stop me and be like, hey, do you do identity? Well, I mean, yeah, I guess. Okay, well, I do, and they would spit it out. And the truth is that as you can see across those 8 disciplines at the bottom, that can mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of different people, and there's a whole lot of segmentation even inside that identity pillar. And so what I use this slide for is having a conversation around what privilege access management inside identity is supposed to look like. I have done a bunch of panels over the past 2 years. I've had the opportunity to sit on panels with guys that are smarter than me, which is not that difficult. And one of the things that we talk about inevitably, because it's usually a panel that I'm doing at least, is PAM and where that fits inside zero trust. And guys like Steve Wallace talk about PAM being a cornerstone to implementing identity, identity being the cornerstone of any valid zero trust implementation. So I use this block so that I can kind of start in the top left of the red block, right? Where it says password storage. And this is basic password storage. So we have a place where all of our passwords are logged. We know all of our assets. We know what they are. We know what all of our accounts are. Everybody can access this so that they're all like not on sticky notes on everybody's desk, so at least everybody's on the same page. And every time this thing gets accessed, we put it in our SIM or there's a log for it. So cool, we're like baseline. And then we get to password management. Now we have some SOPs. Now we have things like ad hoc password management. So if somebody wants to get one of these passwords, they get it, and then when they're done with it, it gets rotated. We end up with things like service account management. So you have service accounts that are admin accounts. They're non-human, and as you have those accounts, they don't get rotated very often. I know that's going to surprise a lot of people in this room that your service accounts don't get rotated very often. But as a case in point, when you get to that stage, you are discovering those service accounts, you know where they are, you're rotating those passwords on those accounts, and then you're actually rotating the password inside the services itself so that it can, sure.
Terrible deployments don't rotate. Good deployments do certs and don't.
Okay.
I would argue. That wasn't really my question. What about integration? And could you talk a little bit about the behavioral analysis and how you actually tune the platform? Because when you do a zero trust deployment, if you do behavioral analysis, that means like the first, like, I don't know, 6 months to build from scratch, people are just getting shut down. How is that?
So you would think that. So a couple of things, going back to your first thing, while I would tend to agree with you, I also know that 80% of federal agencies today still use service account passwords. So, well, I mean, yes, but we still have to have a solution to manage it. If I could get them to change to certificates today, I would absolutely do that. As for UBA, inside those, we have deployed solutions to, at this point, 3 million endpoints plus, and we have learned what particular patterns of behavior general users have. And so we find that our standard implementation of how we handle just-in-time and privilege handles about 80% of users' use cases. So you don't have users. So, I mean, while this does apply in the commercial space, we also have this deployed inside DoD and federal as well. So we have actual data across all verticals for this, so we understand how this is going to work and how it's going to get deployed. And again, we're going to cover 80+% of the use cases. If you have more specific questions around that, we can take them offline after. Yeah.
Yeah, so part of the problem with behavioral analysis is you have to have a clean data set where people are not already in the system, such a bad actors in the system, and then do that behavior such that you see it as a hit.
Yeah, I understand. We can take it offline after. So from password management, we talk about session management and the ability of things to, the ability of not handing out password accounts to begin with, right? So what we're doing is we're actually just granting sessions for, people to have where they don't ever get those credentials to begin with. We're recording what they're doing on those sessions, we're watching them, and they're never actually getting those credentials at all. And then we get to that full privilege management, where we have conversations about not having privileged accounts, which is kind of fun. Whether it's on an endpoint or whether it's even admins, what we can do is actually take token injection and manipulation and use a resultant set of policies, or the quick starts, as I referred to a few minutes ago. And we can actually allow policy and the application to elevate, rather than the users actually having permissions to do anything themselves. So even if a user's account gets compromised, credentials get compromised, they attempt lateral movement, there's nothing for them to do because their account doesn't have any permissions. And then we circle back around to the bottom and we talk about integrating with other assets, we talk about analytics and reporting, we talk about all of those kinds of things and making sure that we are integrating into a broader ecosystem. Because PAM that exists on its own is still not an effective tool. Like, that's the way that that goes. I know that's going to sound wild coming from somebody who's a PAM vendor, and I would love to sell every person in this room PAM. But the truth is, if we're going to have a conversation about identity and zero trust, doing it by itself isn't effective. It has to be a it has to be part of a broader strategy to implement zero trust across your network. And that's basically what we're saying here, right? Applying that granularity of privileged access management. It's like that concept of just-in-time manufacturing, right? You want people to have exactly the privilege they need for exactly how long they need it. Allowing somebody to have privilege for too long is as much a threat vector as over-privileging an account that exists, right? So whatever it is, they need to have that ethereal component to how long they have privilege. There's no sense in a domain admin actually having privileges 24/7, 365. Like, they don't need it. So, again, how does PAM enable that zero trust implementation? Providing that granular privilege control to enforce least privilege is at the top of the list. And then having a variety of those controls. So, you realize very quickly inside an environment that not everybody gets the same use case. In my house, we have several vehicles. For a while, I had a Corvette that I loved, and I still am mad that I sold. But the truth is that the privileges my kids get as they learn to drive are going to be drastically different than the privileges the adults have in my house as they learn to drive, right? I have an 86 Trans Am that I'm rebuilding in my shop right now. And it's going to be a lot of fun to drive. And my 16-year-old kid is probably not going to experience that outside of a very controlled environment, right? I'm not going to give him the keys and say, hey, like I said, I live in Arkansas, I live in like the Delta Flatlands, so there are miles and miles of highway. I can tell you all about the things I did as a teenager and the things my kids are going to want to do. And as such for that, I understand that he is going to be restricted in his privileges with that vehicle, right? So we do the same thing as we talk about endpoint privilege management. You have some users that are developers. You have some users that are power users or researchers. You have some users that are handling data. And then you have other users that they use Word, and that's all they do, right? So inside each of those use cases, you have to understand that the privileges should adjust for these users. We're not just talking about taking privileges away from the users. We're talking about having a set of policy that gives them exactly the privileges they need. And then, of course, having those policies and sessions implemented correctly, integrated with your SIM tool, integrated with your logging, integrated with your user behavior, is that basis for understanding what a user's typical behavior is. When you have an endpoint privilege management application or product or module installed, then you know what applications are running in your environment, you know which ones require privilege, you know what users typically are using these applications, you know when, you know how they typically use them, and now you have a firm data set for what their typical behavior would be. I like this slide just because I was able to put some of our logos in there. I really don't know what it means. No, I'm just kidding. So as we take a look at this slide, the one thing that we talk about, right, is those policy administration and the policy enforcement points. So with a platform that handles privilege access management, and as we continue that conversation around zero trust, having an administration tool that can manage policy for your privilege inside your environment is a vital subset to the concept of just-in-time privilege. And then when you combine that access, or you combine that particular administration with a policy engine like, like SailPoint, or any of the other IDPs out there, you end up with this space that they can actually provide additional context and information for your policy administration. So then when you do that policy enforcement, depending on their role or depending on how your UBA is turning out, things can change. Access can change. If their location has changed, access can change. If the time of day has changed, their access can change. All of those things can exist together and make sure that you are continuing with that just-in-time least privilege model. The one thing that we haven't talked about yet, and I'm going to kind of pause for a second before I roll down this slide, and also I promise I'm not going to read this slide. I'm from Arkansas, and I don't always get the privilege of knowing that everybody in my audience can read, but I'm going to assume that everybody in here can read. So I'm going to let y'all read this slide as I have a conversation about what it means to manage identities and privilege across a network. See, thus far, I've only been talking about human identities, about heartbeats that exist behind a desk. But the truth is, non-human identities, IoT devices, service accounts, all of those other things are outpacing human identities at a 2-to-1 ratio right now. So we have a ton of things that are touching our network. And as we talk about zero trust and that first pillar of identity across the zero trust diagram, we have to realize that an identity has to exist for the devices that aren't human, for the objects that aren't human. And we have to understand how we're going to handle that. We have to understand what those assets are. We have to understand how we're going to manage authentication and authorization onto our network for those devices. As we have those conversations, we also have to realize that somewhere along the way, we've kind of done this like wave ride where we started out saying, hey, they're just, they need network access, we're going to put them on our network. And then we went to the point of we're like, oh, well, they're IoT devices and we don't really worry about them, so we're going to put them on a different network. And then we came back and we said, oh, well, we're going to converge them back into our networks, right? The challenge with that is, for the past 15 years, IoT devices have been installed by people whose primary career wasn't cybersecurity or IT. It was HVAC, or installing doors, or installing electrical panels, or installing manufacturing equipment. This is a real live example that I hate to love to use in this particular presentation. About 8 months ago, I was having a conversation with a vendor because we handle access inside IoT devices and operational technology devices with one of our modules. I was having a conversation with a vendor, and we were talking about how he was monitoring his coolers. And he was monitoring his coolers over straight, clear HTTP, and it was wide open to the internet. And this is 8 months ago. Like, we're not talking years ago. This is like 8 months ago. And as I'm having this conversation with him, and he's an expert in installing these particular food refrigeration coolers for farms all over the country, I said, hey, this is not an acceptable form of monitoring these coolers. Like, we can't do this. Like, we are wide open to a breach as we're doing this. And his response to me was, well, my coolers haven't been breached yet. And I was like, I wish I could live in that world. And also, let's ask Target how well that worked out for them with their operational technology. Because at the end of the day, we have to understand how those devices work, what their authentication is. We have to understand what their passwords are. Back to the conversation about default passwords. How many devices do we have on our network that are IoT devices that we're converging back onto our networks that probably have a default password because the guy that I went to high school with that didn't make great grades now installs that stuff, right? In the middle of Arkansas, and I'm still teaching him what dial-up internet is. And he's not going to change the password on that because he's not going to remember any other password. Like, if he keeps it default password, then every time he goes to work on it, he can work on all of them. It's easy, right? But we have to know what to do with those. Because those are now identities that we have to manage, and we have to understand how they integrate into our lives, into our networks, into our cyber environments. So, as we continue to talk about the zero trust tenets that we have and the ways that BeyondTrust can help, again, I'm going to send you guys this deck afterwards, I promise. As we continue that conversation throughout, we have a place where, and I don't know how I missed the slide. We usually have a slide that has all of our TAP partners, because as we handle zero trust, as this is a thing that we're doing, we have to understand that this is an alliance between industry, between government, between commercial partners in how we're going to achieve this. Zero trust architecture is a strategy or a direction, right? So as such, it is something that we're going to have to come to the table as vendors. Other vendors are going to have to come to the table and understand that we have to work together to achieve this particular problem and to solve it, right? We were one of the earliest adopters of SCIM connectors, which is a standardized connector that allows us to connect to other IDP platforms and identity platforms. We're a big proponent of continuing to do that across other identity platforms because as we have a conversation about zero trust, there's so many vendors out there that do this, and there's so many different ways to go about this that if we as vendors aren't prepared to work with other vendors, and if our customers aren't prepared to have real conversations about what their challenges are, then this is a challenge that isn't going to get solved. So I spent a couple of years somewhere in the middle of my career doing Active Directory migrations, which is a whole lot of fun if you've ever done one. I highly recommend you never do that in your life. But anyways, I can remember the way that we started Active Directory migrations, and it went something like this. We were going to have a workshop, and we're going to get all of the stakeholders in a room, and we're going to have a giant whiteboard, and we're going to start with a timeline and achievable objectives. And as we talk through these stakeholders, we're going to talk about Active Directory enabled applications, Active Directory aware applications. We're going to talk about email. We're going to talk about users. We're going to talk about timelines. And we planned this for weeks. Huge whiteboards worth of information. Like it was almost overplanned. Not really, but this was something we thought through with very, very detailed organization. And what I have seen over the past 5 years inside the identity space and the broader zero trust space, and you see it with a lot of the vendors that are doing zero trust, is we have an SM8, we have NIST guidelines now. CIS has released some guidelines about the first couple of ways that you can do this, beginning steps. And we're having lots of conversations around this. But when it comes time to actually implement this, the planning phase of how this works, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to integrate, and who's going to handle UBA, and who's going to monitor that, and which silo of which IT department is going to handle which things of these, is not a thing we're making a plan for. And if you have any doubt that we haven't planned well for this, one of the major pillars of zero trust is data. In order for data to be considered zero trust, we have to figure out how to tag it with standards. And I dare any of you to tell me that we have a standard for our data tagging across the DoD today. I mean, it's going to be, but we don't even have a standard for, like, what tags are going to mean what, like, at this point. And it's a huge chunk of what zero trust implementations are going to be. This is going to require collaboration. It's going to require planning. It's going to require conversations. How are we starting? Where are we finishing? And we're not going to finish, by the way. That's why I have a job. And I hope that we don't finish in some ways because I still like taking my kids to Disney World, and I don't know what I would do if I didn't do this. So, because I'm not very outdoorsy. So, anyways, as we look at these things, as we have these conversations, these are conversations that we have to have with integrators that are out there. We have to see what it looks like when these products work together. We have to know what our achievable outcome is, and we have to have a map for that. And we have to know what our first step is. And there's a whole lot of not that going on as we're trying to talk about zero trust. So, as we continue those conversations, we need to agree as a group what first and next and last steps are. And that's why I have the tap slide in here usually. is because we can't do it alone at BT. Our partners can't do it alone. You're not going to be able to do it by yourself. I used to laugh when we would do these migrations, and people would be like, yeah, I think we can handle most of this lift ourselves. And I would just look at them and go, how many accounts have you migrated in your career? Like, an Active Directory migration of any kind of size is usually a once-in-a-lifetime event, right? For most IT people. For us, it was a career for a little while. And you're not going to understand the depth or complexity of what you're getting into. And those people would usually call us in 6 or 8 months and go, okay, we have no idea what the hell we're doing. And we're there with Zero Trust for the most part. So at BT, we have several pillars of products. That's what this slide is in here for. And each one of these products is kind of uniquely suited to fit a niche inside Zero Trust, and I'd love to talk to you more about those in our privileged password management, in the way that we handle remote access without VPNs and can read tags and meta tags and all those kinds of things, and with our endpoint solution that I talked a little bit about and got an early introduction thanks to our extra special guest. If you have any more questions about those, I would love to have a conversation with that. Hey, I told you that slide was in here. I just flipped it around. If you have any other questions about the way that we can help you or what we do as a company, I'd love to talk to you after we talk about this. We have several white papers and use cases that we have done. For this one, we have an Army customer that had about 15,000 endpoints, and we were working on integration with both the DISA ICAM architecture. We were doing performance testing against the competition. This is one of our particular white papers that we had in one of the test pilots that we did for the Army. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because I'm going to trust you to be able to do that. So this one is actually in phase 1 for a DoD agency that has about 1,500 units deployed today and is continuing to grow, and when it's done will be one of the largest organizations inside DoD and inside our company as a deployment. They have our entire suite of products, and as such, they are finding themselves continually able to implement Zero Trust principles that they did not think they would be able to begin with, including in their endpoint privilege management. Something that I didn't talk a lot about was Unix and Linux and how we handle centralized policy and elevation for privilege escalation inside Unix and Linux boxes. So we have some white papers that you'll get in the deck, or I can send the links to you. Again, I really thank everybody for your time today. I hope you got something out of the presentation at least. And if there's anything I can ever do to help you, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be up here. I'll take questions now if anybody has any questions that they want to ask now.